I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video what we're going to do is to look at the Multiband Compressor. Now this is one of Logic's most powerful plugins. It's also, just to offer you a little warning, the plugin that could potentially do the most damage to your mixes if you don't know what you're doing with it, or if you sort of abuse it a little bit. So what we're going to do within this tutorial is to look at how we can use it to maximize the power of our mixes without going overboard, without going crazy. So what we need to do is to find out exactly what multiband compression is and how it changes or is different from regular compression. Well, before we get into that, let's have a listen to the section of this track that we're going to be working on as we look through the multiband compressor. Now you'll notice first of all, what I've done is to choose a project where what we've got is lots of things happening at once. And I don't just mean lots of tracks, I mean lots of treble, lots of mid-range and lots of bass. And multiband compression is at its most effective when what we've got is lots of frequency content all happening at the same time. In other words, it's a really popular choice for the output stage of your mix. If what you want to do is to effectively say, okay, well potentially the compression needs of the bass of this track are different from, let's say, the treble, I can't just come up with one compression solution which is going to affect all of those frequencies. What I want to do is to find something which can break the frequency content of my mix down into different areas and apply different compression settings to those. And that's exactly what multiband compression is. Now in Logic, the multiband compressor is actually called the Multipressor, which is obviously just multiband compression for short. And it looks like this. Please update the graphical user interface, Apple, please. Please? Okay, so it's looked like this since 1685 when the Multipressor was first released. And okay, jokes about its graphical user interface not being maybe quite as up to date as it might be, we'll leave those aside now because it's still an amazingly powerful tool. But you know, it could be that you haven't really gone there with looking at it because it looks like maybe it arrived on the ark. Okay, so what exactly am I looking at when I turn up or turn on the Multipressor? Well, effectively what I've got are my 4 separate bands, which are going to allow me to process different frequency content with different settings. Now, what I can see is that I've got a crossover frequency between each of these. So in other words, band 1 goes from 20 Hertz up to 160 Hertz, at which point it becomes band 2 up to 1100 Hertz, or 1.1 kilohertz if you prefer, and that runs all the way up to 7.5 kilohertz, etc., etc. Now, all of these can be adjusted. I can decide exactly where I want to set the individual bands from one to the next, and that's the first parameter that I've got available. But to really understand what we're looking at, it's better to focus on one individual band. Now, some third-party multiband compressors allow you to switch on different bands in order to focus in on one or the other, but if you do that within the Multipressor, you'll end up with just one band. This is effectively now just stereo compression. It's one band which is going to run all the way from 20 Hertz up to 20 kilohertz, so you don't want to do that. If what you want to do is to focus on one band, the best thing to do is to solo it. And now we've got 4 bands, but we're just going to be listening to the frequency content in one area. And I'm focusing on this area, which for now runs from 130 Hertz up to 820 Hertz. Again, I may make an adjustment to that in a little while. Now, what I'm going to do when I press play now is I'm only going to hear the frequencies that exist within this particular frequency band. And obviously, as I adjust the sort of left and right hand ends of that particular band, obviously we're hearing less or more of the frequency content of the mix. So effectively what I'm going to do is to focus in on this area, which I'm going to sort of refer to as the engine room of the track. It's not the super low bass and it's not the shiny high treble. It's kind of this sort of mid-range band, or at least one of the mid-range bands, if you like. Now, why might we want to break signal down into different frequency areas in order to process each of those individually. Well, it kind of makes sense that if we were to take the two extreme bands, super low bass and super high treble, the way that a compressor might respond to the frequency areas within those different bands is going to be very different. Bass frequencies are low, slow, undulating waves, which tend to be, with their kick drums, quite percussive and thuddy, but if they're smooth bass lines like the one I've got within this track, they're going to be sort of more slowly evolving and more sustained, whereas the kind of shiny, super skittery high end is obviously producing much more transient content, and therefore if I need to compress it at all, probably I'm going to need settings that respond faster to those transients and recover more quickly as well. So it makes sense that I'm going to need different compression settings for each individual band. So having set the range around which I want to work, my settings are then here. Now, we know about compression, right? Right? Do we? Okay, well, let's find out whether or not we do. The two main parameters that we've got available to decide where exactly we're going to kind of squeeze the dynamics of a sound are the compressor threshold and its ratio. The threshold sets the point above which we begin to bring the volume content within that range down, and the ratio controls how hard we squeeze the compressor. So in other words, if I set a low threshold, I'm compressing lots of the signal, and if I boost the ratio, I'm squashing it a lot. If I set a high threshold, only the loudest moments are going to be compressed, and the ratio is then going to control how hard they're compressed, so how much we begin to pull the level down of the loudest parts within that area. So my threshold is here, and what I can do is to adjust it here, and effectively the lower I drop this, the more of the signal is going to be compressed. And you can see I can adjust it here, but I'm also adjusting this little tag here, so effectively these two things are the same thing. And when I press play, we'll see the input and output levels, so we can see exactly where and which parts of the signal we're compressing. And then the ratio is here. This allows me to determine how hard I am processing the volume of the signals above the threshold point. It's time for me to press play and adjust these, listening rather than just talking about it. Okay, now remember, what compressors do by default is to make things quieter. Why? Well, remember, what they do is to bring down the volume of any parts of the signal which exceed the threshold point. So if I drop the threshold point a lot and increase ratio so that we're really squeezing those dynamics, of course the signal gets quieter. So when I produce that super extreme low threshold, high ratio effect, we lose lots of volume. Now, we'll come back in a moment to how I can add that volume back in just a second. But also what I want to do, and this is one of the main features of a multi-band compressor, is that I want to set attack and release times per band. In other words, what I want to do is to make sure that the attack and the release times for the way that the compressor is working are matched to each individual band. Remember, with a stereo compressor, I've got one attack dial and one release dial, which means it's got to serve the compression needs of all of the bass, all of the treble, and all of the frequencies in between. The advantage of multi-band compression is that I can set attack and release per band. So where do I find those? Well, they're here. So attack is here and release is here. Now, exactly what do these do? Well, the attack time controls how quickly the compressor begins to compress the signal, and the release time controls how quickly it recovers when a signal drops back down below the threshold point. So in other words, how it recovers out of being compressed. So what I'm going to do now is to press play again, and what I'm going to do is to look to try and match the attack and release times to what feels musical and natural in terms of how the kind of dynamics within this particular frequency area feel to me. Again, there are no fixed settings, and I'll be cross with you if you go anywhere near the presets for the multi-band compressor. How on earth can the Multipressor know what your track sounds like? Don't use presets. Don't use presets. Extreme close-up. Don't use presets. Okay, let's go again. Okay, now I'm not going to go, we could do this all day long, and I'm not going to sort of keep you too long. But the reason why I've selected band number 2 is because it contains the kind of top of the bass line, but it also contains some of the kind of skitteriness in the snare drum programming that exists within this track. So effectively, it's an interesting sort of compromise between something which is ultra percussive and something which is much smoother and bassier. So effectively, what I'm trying to do is to use my ears to set an attack time and a release time that feels like it's serving the purposes of both of those two things. And the great thing about frequency content with the tracks is that it's messy. You're never going to have this perfect delineation from one band to another. So we're looking for those compromises in order to make sure that we're trying to serve the best sort of version, if you like, of this particular frequency band. So the last thing I need to do is to think, okay, well, I've lost volume as a result of setting my threshold point and my ratio. Effectively, I've made this frequency band quieter. How do I make up for the lost gain? Well, that's what the make-up gain dial is for. In fact, it's not a dial, it's just this little line. And I can either adjust it here by pushing this line up and down, or I can literally make an adjustment to the level in this little pane here. So if I've lost volume, I can add it back in. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I am going to press play and go through this a few times looking at the other bands. So again, I'm going to rush this in order to make sure that you're not watching an hour-long tutorial, but I'm going to go through band by band and set a threshold point, a ratio, attack and release dials, and a volume for each of these individual bands to see exactly how we can shape each one in turn. Still awake? Will's fallen asleep. Okay, so what we've done here is to very quickly go through each individual band and set some settings for each individual one. And what I'm trying to do very quickly is to find what in particular feels like a sort of natural response for the way that each of those frequency areas triggers the compressor. What do I mean by that? Okay, well, in particular, that kind of snare drum bounce, the kind of skitteriness of that, I want the compressor to be ducking the hardest, most percussive moments of that, but I want it to be recovering in time, that we don't feel like every single snare drum hit, to take an example, is kind of pulling the weight of that down. I want it to feel really controlled from a dynamics point of view, but I want it to feel alive and dynamic. And I want that for the bass too, but as a result of wanting that, my release time at the bottom end is 120 milliseconds compared to 14 milliseconds in band number 3. The needs of these different frequency bands are completely different. Now, effectively, what I end up with when I have gone through and compressed each individual band, if you like, is a volume fader for each individual band. I've got my gain makeup controls setting the relative volumes of each individual band. Now, remember, if I've compressed a signal hard by dropping its threshold a bit further and squeezing it from a ratio point of view a bit more, I'm going to need to turn up its volume a little bit more. So don't just look at the volume increases that I've applied and think that that's how I've rebalanced the mix, if you like. What I've done is to use those right at the end, having set threshold, ratio, attack, and release first. Now, I said right at the beginning of this video that the multiband compressor is capable of doing more damage to your mix than most others, and that's because it's really easy to get swamped in loads of parameters, but also at the end of a day with tired ears, it's really easy to apply some settings that feel right and come back the following day and be amazed that it felt like the bass should be that loud or the treble should be that loud. You'll tend to find as the day goes on, your ears get tired, and what you want is that kind of sweet trebly boost. And nothing is going to give you that quite like the Multipressor, so be careful. It's definitely a good plug-in to come back to the following day to begin to apply these changes. But what you'll find is that you get much more flexibility than you do with stereo compression. So within this video, what we've done is to begin to explore the power of the Multipressor, Logic's multi-band compressor, which looks great, by the way. That was the last time. But what we get a chance to do is to see exactly what these parameters do, how they affect the signal, and as I said, to then effectively rebalance the signal in order to produce more power. And just before we close the video down, what I'm going to do is to listen to 8 bars of this all the way through, and I'll punch it in for the second time. We'll hear exactly what the difference is between the unmultipressed mix and the way that it sounds with the settings that I've pretty hastily put together. So sure enough, I've created a mix which is way too bright. So what I would do now would definitely be to go back in, readjust individual parameters and get to look to sort of bring some of that weight back. Bands 1 and 2 need to be louder relative to 3 and 4 than they are right now. The individual response dynamically doesn't feel too bad, but I've definitely made it all a bit too shiny. So a good example of not rushing and making sure that we're listening and listening again. The Multipressor. Be careful, but enjoy it too.